Hello, everyone, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Virginia Bryant, and I lead customer marketing at GitHub, which means I have the incredible honor of working with and learning from our customers. Today is no exception, as I'm joined by James Zabinski, developer tools for client technology at EY, and Michael Sobczak, engineering manager at Duolingo. Thank you both for being here. During this session, we're going to chat about how EY and Duolingo are enabling their developers to focus on writing and shipping high quality and secure products and solutions instead of managing tooling and overhead. Before we jump in, I do want to go over a few housekeeping items. While I have some questions that I'd love to cover with James and Michael, this session is really meant to be interactive. So please submit your questions in the Q&A tab. You'll find that in the upper right of your screen. I'll ask some as we're going along as they're relevant, and I'll also save a big chunk of time at the end for us to really dig into those questions. We do have chat moderators in the chat with you if you need any assistance. Also, if you have questions for the GitHub team, please don't hesitate to hit the request a demo or schedule a meeting button on the top of your screen, and someone will get back to you after this session. Finally, this is being recorded and will be available next week on the Galaxy page. So the learning doesn't stop after this fireside chat. There'll be a forum this afternoon that will continue to look for ways that you can remove friction from your developer experience using GitHub. And that kicks off at 3 p.m. Eastern, noon Pacific. On Thursday, we're going to dive into the best practices for securing your software supply chain. And on Friday, learn how to power up your developer velocity by enabling collaboration. Finally, at the end of the session, we're going to put up a QR code that will allow you to scan it and provide some feedback so we can continue to improve. So please consider taking a moment to share your thoughts with us. And with that, let's dive in. James, Michael, thank you again for joining me.
Thank you.
Thanks for being here.
I'd like to begin by understanding the lay of the land at EY and Duolingo. So it'd be great if you could each briefly tell us a bit about your developer organization, just kind of what it looks like and what tools you're leveraging as part of your DevOps workflow. James, would you be willing to kick us off?
Sure. So at EY, we're a fairly large company, about 480,000 employees worldwide. For developers, we have multiple types of developers. We have our internal developers that build solutions for EY. We also have client-serving developers working in our consulting practice, as well as citizen developers, just people that work around EY that build things to help them improve their own way of life. From a tool perspective, I think it's important to think in terms of capabilities. Our goal is to ensure that we have the right tools to enable the entire DevOps lifecycle. So shifting left as much as possible is key. Our goal is to reduce friction for solution delivery as much as possible. If you shift left, but you add a heavy process, you can disrupt the natural flow of the developer, which could lose any gains you would have received by introducing tooling, potentially even making things worse. So we use tools like Advanced Security, GitHub Advanced Security, Dependabot, which shifts left inside of the developer's natural flow. So it automatically scans. There's nothing that they have to do to trigger that scan to happen. If it finds any issues, it will automatically submit a pull request for them to review. So that very naturally follows the normal developer flow. It doesn't introduce any additional disruptive processes, and it helps them to reduce friction and deliver a more secure solution. So we have other capabilities that we're enabling through tooling. Obviously, we have build and deploy automation. We have the ability to trace from requirements to value using our better together strategy with Azure DevOps boards, working with GitHub. We've used infrastructure as code. We have continuous testing for the full testing pyramid with unit testing, API testing, and UI testing, all automated. I think one of the keys that's often overlooked is database DevOps. We focus a lot on code because it's easy, but database is hard to do and even harder to DevOps. So it's important to support your developers with tools to do that. Code quality is key. You want to make sure you're not developing bad code quickly. And then having security testing container security testing, dynamic security testing, static security testing, and also, configuration management to ensure you're not drifting your either security posture or your configuration of your environment. So that's just an example of things that we're working on within EY. Awesome.
Thank you so much for that. Michael, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, so Duolingo obviously doesn't have the 100,000 plus employees, not nearly as big of an engineering organization, but still have hundreds of developers. And a key kind of defining aspect of where Duolingo's at development-wise is moving from a monolith to handle the language app and the other ones into a microservice architecture. And this is done commonly once a certain level of scale is reached, and it makes a lot of things much easier to do compared to a monolith, especially in terms of developers being able to push out their aspects of the code or the things they care about without having to coordinate with dozens of other developers. But it also makes a bunch of things much more difficult. Observability, debugging, all much harder to do. Also, even things like enforcing development best practices, having within a repo, a single repo, we have, a bunch of kind of standard off the shelf tools you can use to do linting, pre-commit checks, all of those things. And once you move to a microservice architecture, there's, it's much harder to kind of centralize and standardize on all those best practices. So we use a lot of the tools that James mentioned. I mean, we make heavy use of CI/CD pipelines, automated checks on pull requests and things like that. We're also kind of continuously exploring solutions to harmonize the development of our different microservices, but still retain the benefits of kind of having that development decentralized. So one tool we've been rolling out and exploring with is platform ops level that allows you to check, apply checks in campaigns to, a bunch of different services and assign them to teams and kind of get centralized looks. Another huge advancement in the last maybe half a year or year has been GitHub code spaces. One of the problems that you run into when each kind of service is its own repository with its own libraries and own tech stack is it's kind of a big ask to share service ownership. Somebody's got their development environment all set up and ready to go. To get another developer involved in that, previous to code spaces, they would have had to go through the doc, set up their laptop, probably uninstall or reinstall some dependencies that were the wrong version. And it's kind of a big lift. And now that we've got code spaces and try to enforce, people setting them up for their repos, it's now, running a service that you haven't touched before, just reviewing or testing a PR is now a matter of a couple minutes. And then you have a code space up and running with the right version of Python. It ran the right install hooks. It's got the right Docker image. And you as kind of a new developer onboarding to this repo don't really have to think about any of that. It kind of just works and provides a place where we can easily plug in kind of best practices without asking too much of developers. So like something we've done in a lot of our code space configurations is have CoPilot be installed by default on that code space. And that's been great for getting people to just try it. You don't have to tell people, hey, go to this page, download this plugin. As soon as they use a code space, it's got that enabled, it'll just show up and they can just start using it. And there's a lot of examples like that, that, once you have everything in the code space, you can kind of centralize all that knowledge. And when people come up with good ideas or best practices or anything like that, they can now incorporate it in the code space config and kind of close that loop instead of just being something that gets shared through, tribal knowledge or just talking to people in some kind of informal way. Now it can be kind of just part of the standard tech loop. So it's kind of helped address those questions.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, it seems like core themes for both of you and thinking about how you're enabling your developers are really around, giving people the right tools and solutions they need to just focus on the work and not on all of the overhead and the process and the things that need to happen to make sure, the final product is high quality. And, James, you touched on sort of that shifting left and shifting security left to really ensure that, the work that's being done is meeting all of those quality standards from the beginning. And then, with Michael and the code spaces, you're really like kind of leveling the playing field to an extent for folks who, as you said, might be early career or early in their time at Duolingo. You don't have to have as much like organizational or operational knowledge to be able to start being successful and making meaningful contributions. So that's really interesting. I guess like I'd love to understand a bit about how DevOps and kind of the practice of DevOps has evolved in the way you're approaching it over time. So, is this something that's been really front and center in the way that you've operated for, many, many years now? Or was there kind of like a inflection point where your team decided to start making changes to really optimizing your DevOps or tooling infrastructure? James, you want to kick us off again?
Sure. So, I think we've been, for the last 15 years, working on standardizing and managing a central kind of approach to tooling. I think around 2018 is where we really kind of focused and shifted to a DevOps and a continuous integration and delivery. Our pre that point, there was a lot we knew going much earlier than that's something that we were trying to get to. But if you think, for a company like EY, where we're very risk averse, right? So when you start talking about automation and you start taking things that were previously in the hands of people that had the gates in place to make sure that things happen the way they're supposed to in a secure way, it's not always just about the tooling of like, here's a tool that can automatically deploy your software. So it took some time to kind of change the way people thought about what risk averse means. Like, is it actually risk averse to do it manually, or are we introducing risk because we're doing it manually? So if you think about, we would have our deployment weekends, which, if we had an application that was getting deployed, we would have to spend weeks documenting the step-by-step process in a Word document or a PowerPoint or a project, Microsoft project file with hundreds of steps of first, we log onto the server and then we copy this file and then we run this script and then we do that. And so the deployment would literally take from 5 o'clock on Friday all the way through the end of day on Sunday, going through all of those things step by step, checking them. And then if you have large applications like we do that could potentially being deployed on 500 servers, that's 500 times going through those same steps, right? So it really was becoming unmanageable. So that helped kind of change the way that that we were thinking about things, because in that going through hundreds of steps on 500 servers, one server you forget to run one script in the middle, and suddenly you have intermittent issues with why does the application seem to work sometimes and doesn't work other times. And it really helped to understand that it wasn't being risk averse by avoiding the automation. So that's really what the inflection point was, that we needed a way that we could do what we were already doing. We were already taking the time to break it down step by step. But how do we do that in a way that is truly risk averse and can handle deploying to hundreds of servers, and ensuring that all of those gates that people were in charge of were being still addressed, but using the right and proper tooling.
Yeah, that's really great context. I know we'll talk about this a little bit more, but the idea that it's not just getting the right tools in place, but actually enacting the change that goes around it within a culture, because ultimately, like, there's a people element, there's a cultural element to making change to how you build collectively. So that'll be something that I'd love to talk more on as we continue to dig in. Michael, what about you?
Yeah, so I kind of touched on that on the previous point with shifting from a monolith to microservices has been kind of a huge, defining aspect of development over the past years. And another big one is Duolingo's rapid growth has meant that uh, many new engineers, especially including new grads, so not necessarily people with a ton of previous industry experience, need to be onboarded quickly, effectively, and be able to start contributing. Duolingo doesn't have a ton of employees. Shipping things quickly and urgently is, a really heavy operating principle and part of the culture, and something we all take very seriously. And I, for personal experience with this, had a new hire join my team maybe a month or so back, and like anyone with engineering experience going to a new job, pre-code space, that was usually a day or two process to set up your laptop, run the, maybe more or less half-baked automation scripts that were there, discover problems with them. That would be your first issue of fixing the existing problems with the install guide or updating docs. And then, maybe after a couple days, you'd have like a functional environment. And when brought on and onboarded a new member to the team, showed him, here's how you set up the code spaces, the repositories he was working on were already configured. And, within a half hour, he had a working environment that he was able to just run the code in. Everything was installed, everything was set up. And, that's something I hadn't experienced in my career before. I was so used to that onboarding ritual involving a ton of kind of pain and frustration and updates and never really working, quite right the first time. And so, having that ability to just onboard people and get them working really fast, within less than an hour has been huge game changer. I mean, I kind of hadn't experienced anything like that in terms of how the onboarding process went from super painful to basically trivial or not really a part of the, person's first week plan because it kind of just happens when they click the button. So that's been huge for a company growing really quickly.
Yeah, if I can jump on to what you're saying there, I think the other thing, I don't know if you experience this, Mike, but when we have not just onboarding new to the company, but we have developers that may be working on one product and then they shift to working on another product. And then there's a whole ramp up period of, well, these are the tools and the configuration that we used on the product that was before. Oh, this other product doesn't use those same things or the same configuration. And so, that transition from one team to the other can sometimes take weeks and add the friction of getting the new configuration for laptop. So Codespace, you just jump into the repo and push a button and then you're up and running. So
yeah, and it's been, I mean, it's now leaned in heavily to code spaces, and there's now been probably 6 or 7 different services or repositories that I've like reviewed PRs, run code on, and the code has never even been cloned to my laptop. It was able to all be done kind of on the cloud. And, like I was saying with wanting to push service ownership and how that can be difficult in a microservice environment, it's so great to drop that hurdle where people aren't thinking, yeah, I could probably help out with this service, but I don't want to spend a day or two and like screw up my existing environment for the other things that are like my primary focus. And now just kind of all those issues have really gone away. I mean, pretty incredible.
That's super exciting. I have to ask, like, what was the developers like, when did they say anything about their experience with being able to jump right in? I mean, versus you said it wasn't their first tech company necessarily.
Yeah. So, I mean, we've seen, code spaces are still pretty new. It's not like, everyone at Duolingo is only running on code spaces or anything like that. And I think, a good approach to take with something like that is, if you like your current workflow, you can keep your current workflow. A lot of the people that have been here since before code spaces rolled out, they've got something on their laptop, they've got an environment, they know what to do. We've really seen like where a big uptick happens is when they're kind of faced with what we're talking about of, okay, you need to go contribute to this other project or shift teams. And they kind of think to themselves of, am I really gonna have to go through this whole setup and everything? And that's often where you really see people kind of at least try out code spaces because, they can avoid that pain point. So a lot of it is, new people being onboarded are often just going code spaces from the jump. And then it is so useful for your, maybe not primary projects or services or however you want to define that.
Yeah, I think that answers largely the question that one of the members of our audience asked, but they asked, is Codespaces the primary development environment for Duolingo, or is it augmenting local development environments?
Yeah, so it's currently a hybrid approach. I mean, it's a lot of the stuff we've done over maybe the past 6 months has been the people that are kind of champions of Codespaces, myself being one, and others at Duolingo have done a little bit of the maybe legwork to show, hey, here's how you can just configure this JSON file that lives in your repo, and here's how you set up things with Codespace, or helping other teams. I have randomly, worked with one of the data science teams to help them set up one of their code spaces to have the right credentials or libraries, and, kind of help to push it forward because, all of the users are developers. So a lot of it is just, showing them that initial example, or, hey, here's what it looks like. It's really not that bad. And then once that's done, a lot of stuff is just kind of people see the value of it, and then they're able to kind of be off to the races on their own. So, having kind of champions of the service to get it off the ground is good. But, what we've seen, like if you do have a good product that is really actually enhancing productivity and making the developer experience easier, it doesn't take a massive push or some kind of like imposition from the top down. A lot of it is just enabling people to see the benefits, try them out in a way that doesn't cost them a ton of time or resources, and then, let them kind of build off from there.
Absolutely. So, as more and more organizations are sort of becoming tech companies, from grocery chains that are now viewing themselves as technology organizations, or, we've spoken with automotive manufacturers who are referencing that the cars are more software than hardware these days. How are you thinking, I guess, through either, being able to address the fact that there really is still a shortage of developer talent in the space? There's more and more demand, and there are not, necessarily graduates that are coming out in such a high volume to meet that demand. So how do you think about kind of through the lens of productivity and the current economic climate and all the innovations that are happening around things like AI? How do you view your kind of continued investment in DevOps tooling and the impact you're hoping to realize from that? Michael, do you want to start this one?
Yeah. So, I mean, Duolingo is a tech company that produces software as, the primary thing. So can't really speak to that aspect. James will probably be better on that one. But, still faced by Duolingo of relatively small company, like I mentioned, hundreds of engineers, but millions and millions of daily users, and, lots of things we're exploring and trying to support. So developer productivity is at least, developer productivity is one of the places where a company like Duolingo can have an extremely high amount of leverage. And, like we mentioned with code spaces or CoPilots, any of these tools that make developers even a bit more productive is huge value for the organization. An organization like Duolingo where, the software kind of is the product. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. So I guess for me, I think from a continue to invest perspective, I think if you're not moving forward in technology, you're falling behind. So I think it's critical to always be looking at what is the next thing. Knowing code spaces is coming and how that can improve developer productivity. Knowing CoPilot is is coming and how that can improve productivity. So I think it's always important for somebody in my position to be always understanding what's on the horizon, so that we're not falling behind. You know, if you wait until after it's already the solid thing, then you're already behind the 8 ball and always playing catch up. I think the impact that we've seen, you know, I think I talked before about our deployment weekends where we would spend 2 days doing a deployment. Today, our award-winning DevOps practice runs over 7,000 pipelines per day for DevOps. So from an impact perspective, if you just look at it in straight man hours, right, 7,000 pipelines. Let's say you say one pipeline saved on average 1 man hour. That's a pretty conservative effort, you know, amount of effort you would think for what a pipeline might do, right? So 1 man hour, 7,000 pipelines means that we would be doing 875 man days of work per day. That's over 2 years, 2 man years of work every day. If you look at that from just from an infrastructure as code perspective, we build our infrastructure as code templates with security, reviewing them and certifying that those configurations are secure. So just think about the time that you would save reusing those templates at that scale. Now think about the effort it would take to secure that many ad hoc configurations. Or not only would we be saving the time, but think about the security posture, the confidence that we can have now that our environment is secure because we know that what we're deploying and how we're deploying it is secure. What about testing? If you think about the effort involved in testing that many solutions, what if you were doing that manually? Like, how many tests would somebody have to be going through just to make sure that the applications where each feature is doing what it's supposed to do, right? Not only the time, but think about the quality. You know, you have different people doing the tests. Are they doing them the same way? Are they getting the same result? Is it validating what you expect it to be validating? So what would the quality be like if you weren't using tools? If you look at, speaking of quality, if you just look at code quality, how do you even measure code quality without a tool? Or do you have somebody going through every line by line and say, oh no, this isn't a good way to do that type of function, right? You know, there's no way to realistically look at code quality. Before tooling, the way we measured quality was bugs, right? How many bugs did this have? But bugs don't measure quality, they measure functionality. You could have 0 bugs because it does exactly what it's supposed to do, but it fails every 10 minutes because the code was written terribly, right? So you need a way to know whether the code was written well. We scan and analyze regularly over 27 million lines of code. So you can imagine what that would be like without tooling. Application security, imagine the effort that we would have to go through to manually review that many applications. What are they checking for? How are they checking? And what kinds of recommendations are they making? How would you even certify that many deployments? Or what would that do to impact our security posture? So of all of those things, I think the biggest measure for impact is time to value, right? So what's the potential revenue loss if we can't get the feature or the product out the door? How do we win the business if we don't have the tooling? The thing that we're trying to deliver doesn't exist. If it's stuck behind a security review or a security failure or you know, we couldn't get the infrastructure built in time. In my opinion, you really can't afford not to do DevOps in this day and age.
Yeah,
I
so
mean, that was incredible.
James,
Sorry.
Kind of wondering. So, with that many developers and that kind of scale of pipelines, do you have a central DevOps organization in the company, or is that kind of managed on a per team basis?
Both. We have a central DevOps practice, so we consistently implement DevOps across all of the teams. But those DevOps practitioners are embedded into the product teams because they have to be part of the team that they're, you know, it doesn't make sense to have somebody fly in to try to figure out, hey, what are we making today and how do we get it deployed? They need to understand what it is that the team is delivering, but they also need to understand the best practices of how we do DevOps and EY. So we kind of try to balance the best of both worlds on that.
You know, one of the things that I find really interesting, I mean, and James, you made an incredibly compelling case for the importance of DevOps. And as you can see, you know, in the audience, the bigger the scale, the more critical these are. You know, the things that you can kind of patch together when you're working with a team of 25 or 50 developers don't work when suddenly, you know, you have gigantic organizations, and there's a lot of productivity loss, and there's a lot of you know, inherent risk in that too, because you aren't able to monitor for code quality and for security vulnerabilities and things that can make it to production when you don't have these really regimented checks and processes. And so, you know, by putting that all left and having that be part of the developer workflow, you're also removing that kind of moment of friction that often happens between developer organizations and security organizations, where you know, a security researcher finds something that's really a critical risk and then pushes it back to a developer who's incentivized to work on sprints and ship innovative solutions. And this was 6 months ago, and now, you know, you're having to break flow on your current work and also go back and try to regain the context necessary to fix something that could have just been never introduced in the first place, right? So there's all of these real tangible benefits of just having this great tooling and these best practices for building software up front. But I think the thing I came away with most from what you were saying, James, and I'd love to hear, Michael, if you've seen this within Duolingo as well, but it sounds like just the total amount of stuff, like the total amount of new code and new customer experiences and product experiences that you were ultimately able to deliver to your end consumer has just increased wildly by removing some of what would otherwise been really tactical manual processes. Is that right, James? I mean, have you just seen the amount of innovation increase?
Oh yeah, I think, you know, it's hard to think back to before we didn't do this, right? You know, the amount of time we spent, or you know, I don't want to say wasted, but the effort that went into all of these things and coordinating between all of the different departments and getting all of the approvals, you know, it was very difficult to get features released. So I think, you know, now the teams are able to focus on value and how they can deliver that value as quickly as possible. We do make an effort to make time available for innovation so that we can take some of the time that's been saved by introducing all of these tooling and give it back to the developers so that they can spend time working on, you know, how can I improve, you know, our lives as developers? How can I improve the product, or, you know, do those kinds of things? So I think it's important. I don't think it'll happen naturally. If you just save the time and continually add features to the backlog, then the developers will do the features that are on the backlog, and they're not necessarily going to make their own space to work on innovation. So I think it's important as leaders to recognize that you have saved this time, and how are you going to invest that back into making things continually improve. So I think you have to make the effort to make room for developers to do that innovation.
Awesome. Michael, I'd love to hear from you.
Yeah, I thought it was interesting too, the part you said about having the DevOps people embedded on the team. So I think Duolingo hits a pretty good balance of providing centralized teams that are sort of experts in the domain. So whether that's infrastructure as code or developer infrastructure or, you know, Jenkins or anything like that, and are able to provide tools that then developers can really use in a kind of self-service fashion for the most part. So, you know, if someone is spinning up a new microservice or other common development tasks at Duolingo, there's already provided tools that make that process very easy, very simple. You don't need to be an infrastructure as code expert. You don't need to be a CI/CD pipeline expert. You're able to take advantage of that, but still have the flexibility to kind of adapt what's being done to your specific project. And then also have a kind of place to close the loop where, because we have these centralized sources of kind of functionality or APIs or best practices, if you happen to do something on your project that is generally applicable, there's sort of already an established path to integrate that back into these centralized areas where the rest of the organization or other teams, or future services can benefit from this. So having that kind of feedback loop and having a good balance of centralization to provide expertise, but decentralization to give developers flexibility so they're not constantly being frustrated or slowed down has worked pretty well.
That's great. I do want to ask, Michael, I know you and Duolingo are beginning to utilize CoPilot, and I'd love to hear a little bit about kind of some of your early experiences with adding that to part of your developer tooling.
Yeah, that's a great question. So, well, upfront, personally, I'm a huge fan of CoPilot, and we have introduced it to all of the developers with GitHub accounts at Duolingo now have access to CoPilot, and that's just part of their account. And we've done kind of presentations and like engineering presentations and kind of shared that. And I kind of mentioned many of our code space configurations have CoPilot installed by default now. And it's a product where adoption has been mixed. Like it's definitely going up, but I wouldn't say it's at a point where everyone is necessarily sold yet. But I think part of that is just doing whatever is possible to get it into the hands of developers. I know for me personally, when CoPilot came out, or just even any of the GPT-based tools, oftentimes the articles you would read or press releases will show what are, maybe for lack of a better word, almost like magic tricks. Like just with one line, it'll implement like a neural network, gradient descent algorithm that you wouldn't even know how to do. And that's amazing. I mean, that is extremely impressive, but that's, where I see the value in CoPilot and from people who have started using it is not necessarily that it's going to just implement these crazy algorithms that you personally don't know. It's saving me 5 seconds here, a minute there, 20 seconds there, all throughout the day, all throughout the code. And it's hard to really articulate that to somebody that hasn't really tried it, because I think a lot of people who maybe haven't tried it yet or on the fence are thinking, well, how often do I need to automatically generate like complex algorithms? And, sometimes it can't do that. I mean, CoPilot will still surprise me sometimes on how much it's able to do, but it's really something where, getting in the hands of developers and see, oh, I would have had to go look up the docs for the syntax on bash if statements because I only write one bash script a year and I never remember the syntax. That would have been 20 seconds to Google, find some examples, but now that's instant. And, not a huge saving there, but it's those wins kind of just come rolling in nonstop. So the effort has just really been get developers to try it. Once I'm kind of convinced that once people try it, they'll see the value of it. And so the real push has just been make it so it's enabled automatically here. Developers know where they can get it. They can, we have Slack channels where people can share cool things that they were able to do with CoPilot and kind of just lessen that barrier to just trying it out. And seeing that is really the way to, push adoption.
Yeah, I think that makes a ton of sense. It's offer a carrot is always a great way to get people to try new things. I do think that something that I found really interesting in what you said is, not only is it those little moments that it can kind of help complete something that you know how to write, you can write, but just that little time savings. But, those places, I think there's a great point about what you said about, the one bash command you write a year. Like that is a very, very common experience as a developer, is to be like, I've written this thing, but I don't write it so often, or I'm starting to write something in a new language, and just having that little bit of help so that you're not having to jump to Google or Stack Overflow or GitHub repo and like search, but can just have it kind of at your fingertips. And I know for me personally, all of those moments where I have to jump to Google to look something up become a moment where I might get sucked down the rabbit hole of all of the Slacks and the emails and the, something that's theoretically 20 seconds to find can actually be a massive loss of flow and productivity. So I think that's probably one of the most exciting things to me about CoPilot is really keeping you in that state. You're not breaking flow, you're not screen bouncing, and you can actually invent instead of doing the rote kind of syntax or framework stuff that you need to do as a developer. So really cool. Thanks for sharing. Do you have a sense of, in your own work or your own usage, what would you estimate if you were to say, X% less time to do, a given task?
Yeah. I mean, it's hard to, even just this morning, let's see, I used it to write a cron job syntax because I never remembered that. Would have had to look that up. Had it figure out an unescaped quote string in some complex YAML file that I would have taken forever to figure out. I mean, it's hard to say. It's just, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why, people need to try it, because it's hard to even point to some dramatic time where it saved me 7 hours. It's more just all these tasks that would have taken 5 minutes now take 20 seconds. So yeah, I definitely feel way more productive with it. And like you mentioned too, not just getting distracted with Slack, breaking that flow of going out of the IDE, you're not writing code anymore. Part of whatever context was in your head slips away. You got to reload it. So, I don't know what to attach as a percentage to it, maybe 40 or something, but it feels like just an indispensable tool. It's kind of hard for me to imagine not using something like this now that I've had, 6 or so months of kind of experience with it.
That's super exciting.
Yeah.
Well, thanks for sharing that.
Yeah. And something too that's been really cool to see is enabling people that maybe have some technical experience, but wouldn't be comfortable writing an application from scratch. There are non-developers now utilizing these tools to write bash scripts where they wouldn't have done that without CoPilot. They would have done it manually or something like that. Or, people that aren't even engineers using GPT or CoPilot to generate SQL queries, so they don't have to go bother a data scientist to run whatever report they're looking for. So there's kind of all these side benefits too of it's, really dropping a lot of barriers to, developing software.
That's great. I can't wait to see where you go from here. Sounds like, I wouldn't complain about being 40% faster at my job. So I want to head to questions from the community pretty shortly here. But before, I would love to just ask, I guess, one more question around this, which is, putting the best tools or the best processes into the hands of your developers is really only half the battle, as we talked about at the top of the conversation. There is a massive amount of work that has to go into culture change and getting people to, you can lead the horse to water, but you can't make them drink, but, for developers. So how do you think about really helping to educate people, to helping to drive adoption, to helping to make, tool changes and process changes as simple and frictionless as possible for your employees, so that they can stay focused on building innovation instead of all of the other work that can bog down a developer? James, why don't we start with you on this one?
Sure. I think that's a great question. I think, it starts with having your developer tools, your DevOps tools, kind of first class in your organization. I think for EY, we make developer tools first class part of our EY Fabric platform to really make it so that it's just part of how you do business, right? So it's not something that you have to go and figure out what am I supposed to use or whatever. I think one of the kind of pitfalls or anti-patterns that I've experienced is really kind of decentralizing the tooling or treating it as an afterthought or as a back office thing, that it doesn't really matter. They're just tools, right? So if you think about, if you were a world-class developer, not code developer, but like building developer, you wouldn't just expect people to show up at your job site with, the hammer that they borrowed from their neighbor, right? You want them to be using the right tools to build world-class, buildings, right? So you wouldn't do that in the building world. You shouldn't do that in the development world. The other thing, though, is it doesn't where the difference between like a hammer or a nail gun. You could give a nail gun to an inexperienced builder, and they could build inexperienced things faster. But a lot of the tools in this space really help to improve. So if you don't have the experience, they can help you do a better job to make sure that the thing that you're building is going to pass code. We talk about, shifting left security or compliance or things like that, that really the tools enable the developer to do their job better. I think the other thing to think about is, I think there's a best in breed fallacy with tooling where when you go into the space, you look at, okay, well, this is the best tool for X and this is the best tool for Y, and you just throw them all together into a big toolbox, and they don't fit together. You have Legos and Duplo, and they don't fit, right? So your toolbox ends up being disruptive to the people that are trying to use it. So I think in order to have developers that really kind of want to use what you're offering, you need to think about it as a developer would and have an ecosystem, that these are tools that work well together, so they make my life easier, right? If you're giving me tools that I have to change context in order to use this other tool, then I'm not going to want to do that, because I want to stay in the headspace that I'm in. I want the tools that are going to work together. So I think even though we're talking about how do you change the culture, I think it really starts with making sure you're selecting the tools that work well in the context of the developer and your organization. I think the other thing that's critical is listening to your developers, right? They didn't start developing when they walked through the door. They likely have been developing for quite a while, and that's why you hired them to work for you as developers. So they probably know what tools they like to use and why they like to use them, or what things they've had trouble with in the past that they'd like to not have trouble with. So talking to your teams to understand what are the problems that you're facing when you're doing development, what is the friction that you're seeing, what's stopping you from delivering. And if you solve those problems for them, if you address their concerns, you don't have to convince them to use it. You've made their life easier. Doing this makes my life easier. Sounds great. I'm going to do this because it makes my life easier. Where if you take the approach of we need to make standards and everybody has to use this tool because this is the tool that we've decided is the standard, but it conflicts with what they're doing, then they're constantly creating friction. So they're going to resist using the tools that you're offering because they make their lives more difficult. So I think it all kind of stems from, making sure you have the right tools, you have a strategy. It's not just a random set of tools. I think it's important that it's centralized, regardless of the size of your organization. The saying, a rising tide lifts all boats, but only if you're in the same ocean, right? If you have everybody that's in, you're in an ocean, you're in a lake, he's in a pond, right? Then you introduce a new capability like CoPilot or advanced security or actions or something like that. And it only affects the people that are in that body of water, and the rest of the organization doesn't get any benefit from those tools. I think when we launched advanced security, we didn't have to do a big effort to get everybody on board, right? Everybody already is using GitHub. And so by turning on event security, automatically, proactively, it's scanning for vulnerabilities in your open source code that you have. It's automatically scanning for secrets that you've inadvertently exposed in your code. And that happens for just because you're in the environment. You didn't have to take an extra step to do that. We just launched GitHub Actions today. We've been using Azure pipelines for years. And we've been working with GitHub Actions to make sure that we had the right kind of parity with the features that we're using in Azure pipelines, and the fact that we're going to introduce this is going to either be the same or better than what they have had before. But and because we've been able to create shared actions and shared workflows and things that are really going to increase productivity, all of that just comes with, you're in the game. You get all of the toys that the rest of us are already getting. So it really, I think that's where the key is. If you have everything you treat it as a strategic part of your organization, and you put intentional thought into what should we be using and why, and you're making sure you're listening to the developers, so you're addressing their concerns, then the rest just comes with it. You don't have to try very hard to get people to do things that make their lives easier.
That's great. Michael, do you want to add anything to that before we go to questions?
Yeah, I'll make it quick. I want to echo a lot of the things James said. I mean, I think sympathy for the developers, or empathy for the developers, is really important. And, if you have some tool as manager or DevOps person that you think is a huge deal, huge win, and you're not seeing any adoption by developers, first off, maybe question, they're probably not avoiding adoption just to be difficult. So maybe reevaluate if it's actually the big win you think, or maybe there were things you're missing. And, I want to echo what James said too. Developers, if provided with a tool that's genuinely helpful, you don't need to impose it. I mean, they'll use it. Like if IDEs just came out and they were using Notepad, you wouldn't have to impose that. They would adopt it. And, a big part of it is understanding what the actual pain points are and lowering the barriers as much as possible. If it's an actually good tool, you make sure people are educated on it, it's as easy as possible to access it, then the rest should kind of be letting the product speak for itself, or letting the tool speak for itself.
That's great. Well, let's go to some of the questions from our audience, and thank you all for dropping those in throughout the conversation. I love this one. How do you communicate the business case around budget increase that a code space environment creates compared to local development? So Michael, I think that one's probably for you.
Yeah, I mean, so there have definitely been some conversations around that. But there, it's a trade-off, right? Because yes, you're paying by usage, whereas maybe in some indirect sense, you're paying for usage of your laptop and depreciating over time. But, like any kind of engineering decision, right? There's trade-offs. So yeah, you're paying for usage, but as we've kind of been talking about, I mean, we see all of these different benefits. And, we've been talking about developer stuff, but not even just to mention security. If my work laptop got stolen and hacked right now, none of Duolingo's source code would be at risk, right? They wouldn't have my GitHub two-factor authentication. They wouldn't be able to connect to any of my code spaces. And I know that's a big deal for, people at the organization. So yeah, I mean, it depending on your use case or situation, it could be a tough sell, but I think it's, one of those things where it's not just an extra cost, it's an extra cost in exchange for all these benefits we've been talking about, and that's kind of how it has to be framed.
Yeah,
That's super helpful.
I think the other thing, and you didn't touch on it, maybe it's not as much of an issue for you, but when you have to think about the laptop itself, right? If you're developing locally, generally developers need a more powerful laptop, right? So I think part of the business case, if you can drive the adoption of code spaces, is that you don't necessarily need the super powered laptops and how you decide on what a developer laptop is, because it becomes less of the machine that you need the power on, where you can build the power into the cloud, where it's easier to get the power when you need it. The other thing, Codespaces does a really nice job, I think, of metering itself. So if you're not actively using it, it will go to sleep. So, unlike a VM where you might be thinking of, a virtual desktop or something like that, and equating that to Codespaces, it's not the same. If you're not actively using your Codespace, it doesn't cost the money. It will recognize that you're not using it right now, and it will go to sleep. So you're only paying for the minutes that you're actually actively using it for development, give or take 15 or 30 minutes. I forget what the timeout is. So it's not like, the cost will be related to the amount of value you're getting out of actually using the code space.
Got it. That's super helpful. This is probably a general question. I'm not sure if either of you, I know you're probably looking at CoPilot a little bit as well, James, but how easy is CoPilot to adopt from a legal, license, and risk perspective? I know this is specifically, they're asking about more constrained environments like financial or government. Do you have anything you could share on that, Michael?
Yeah, well, so don't necessarily have experience in working in those environments, but I think it touches on a important kind of point of using CoPilot as a tool, or using any generative AI as a tool, where you want to be careful to, having CoPilot write some code for you, and then you ship it, and then later you realize there was a security vulnerability, is sort of like the nightmare scenario where this tool actually contributed negatively. And I think partly, part of that is using the tool professionally and properly, which comes with experience. To avoid these kinds of problems, you want CoPilot to be writing tiny snippets at a time, or very well-defined single, domain kind of functions that you're more likely to be correct. And another huge part of it is, having testing. So assuming you have kind of reasonable test coverage of your system and how it's supposed to work and what the specs are, that should catch when, just in the same way that it catches when a human developer creates bad code, which, so it's not like bad code being generated is somehow unique to CoPilot, right? It can definitely happen because maybe you're not reading the outputs, but like any bad code catching, a huge part of it is knowing ahead of time what your inputs and outputs should be, having test coverage for that. But it's definitely something that, yeah, you have to get used to with CoPilot, and try to kind of mitigate that by narrowing each snippet as much as possible. If you're using CoPilot to complete 3 lines of code, that is much easier to kind of verify than if you're having CoPilot generate a 40-line function for you. But I think the main solution, because it's not realistic to read every line that's being output by it, is going to have to be some kind of testing or specs, that you're able to kind of make sure it's good against.
Yeah,
Got it.
I'll say, honestly, we because of the potential implications of using AI, that's one of the barriers to entry for a company like ours. So it's definitely something that requires the right people with the right skills to look at. From a legal perspective, from a security perspective, it's not the individual use of this particular, I used it to evaluate this code, but what is the impact if I turn on CoPilot? How is that potentially exposing IP, or how am I potentially bringing in external IP into our environment? Those are beyond my ability, so I think it's important to include the right people from your organization to review how that works.
Great. I think we are down to probably only having time for 1 or 2 more questions. James, this one is for you. I'd love to hear more about the Azure pipelines versus GitHub Actions story. I see more future-proof in GitHub Actions, but I'm in the early stages of using Azure pipelines. And then someone else asked how the switch was going. So can you tell us a little bit about that?
I think when I talked earlier about ecosystem, GitHub and Azure DevOps work very well together, right? But GitHub works better with itself than any other external tool, including Azure DevOps. So, when you look at things like advanced security, CodeQL, or gating or required branch protection policies, GitHub works much better with GitHub Actions than it does with any external tool. There's ways to make it work so you can get the same capabilities, but it will work much better with itself. We've also noticed that it's much more flexible in terms of if you're building your own kind of shared or reusable components. for your actions for your workflows. There's much more, like if you dig in behind under the hood of what you can include in your output of your pipelines, it's very robust. I think GitHub could do better with their own examples of how to use some of those features, because it seemed at first glance to not be as robust as Azure pipelines, but as we dug in, we found that it actually was much more robust than what we could do with Azure pipelines. So we're at the early stages of our official conversion, but everybody that's been using GitHub Actions loves it.
Awesome. Well, we are at our time for our session. Thank you both so much for joining and having this wonderful conversation. I really enjoyed the time, and I think our audience did as well. We will put up that QR code for the folks in the audience. If you could just take a second, grab a screenshot of our little, I guess, a phone grab of that, and take a couple of moments to just offer us some feedback. That really helps us to make sure that we're making these sessions as impactful as possible moving forward. Well, hopefully we'll see you back in a couple of hours for our forum this afternoon and throughout the week. So enjoy the rest of your day and enjoy your time with Galaxy. Bye-bye.